trying to slant the news coverage. So often today, of course, news coverage is often filled with opinions. But at one time, that was not, or at least the striving was to keep opinions out of news pieces. Can we find that anywhere? Does journalistic objectivity exist today?
Yeah, I mean, so I think the situation with objectivity in journalism, a little bit of what's going on there is the public is witness.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Mark Volashin. I've got 12:54, still a little bit early, but I wanted to let you know that right as we get close to 1, we'll see if there's others that are joining, and then we'll start it up. Right now, though, could somebody give me a thumbs up or something in the chat real quick so that I know that you can see me and or hear me, please?
We can see you and hear you, Mark.
Say again? Oh.
We can see you and hear you.
Oh, thank you, Greg. Perfect. You were a little bit garbled there, but I appreciate that. Thank you so much. All right, I'll mute now, and then I'll be back on here in a few moments. Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Mark Ballasts. I'm the Deputy Secretary of State for Elections. Thank you for joining me today for our regulations workshop. A couple notes before we get going. There's still some individuals that are joining. That bell noise that you hear, that's a handful of individuals that are still logging in. While that will likely continue for the next few minutes, we are going to go ahead and start out of respect for your time. See if it's good to see quite a few of you that I recognize and have worked with over the past few months. I appreciate your attendance as well here. If you do have any issues, by the way, from a technical nature, please let me know in the chat also. I will address that too here in a moment. Okay, but that being said, good afternoon. I am calling this hearing to order, or this workshop rather, to order at 1:03 p.m. As I said, and for the record, I am Mark Ballasts, Deputy Secretary of State for Elections, and I will be conducting this regulation workshop today. Before we begin, I would like to clarify a few things. Our discussion today during this workshop will be focused on the proposed temporary regulation listed in the agenda. We should not discuss changing statutes, which are, of course, created by the legislature. This regulatory process will not alter any existing laws. If there are general questions about elections procedures, I'll be able to discuss them as long as they relate to the proposed regulation. If there are questions that extend beyond the regulation on the agenda, I would be more than happy to set up a separate meeting at another time. Of note, I will cover the process for temporary regulations and the differences between temporary, permanent, and emergency regulations during agenda item 3. To discuss a topic not related to this regulation, please contact me at nblect@sos.nb.gov. For your convenience, I will copy that email address into the chat now. Please keep in mind that the Zoom chat, as I mentioned before, is intended for individuals to indicate that they are interested in providing comment and not for general conversation. This is the public workshop for the Secretary of State Elections Division proposed temporary regulation with LCB file number T002-22. The text of the proposed regulation has been provided. I will also now put that notice into the chat as well for someone that, just in case somebody doesn't have it handy. One moment. Here we are. This is the link to the file. There we are. The text of the proposed regulation is now in the chat. This notice includes the agenda and text of the proposed regulation for your reference. The notice the notice of workshop to solicit comments on proposed regulation was noticed at all required locations on July 26th of 2022. Each of these documents is hereby submitted into the record. We continue to receive written comment from members of the public as well relating to this regulation. To date, we have received 19 emails and other correspondence relating to this regulation. All written public comment received by the Secretary of State's office is hereby submitted into the record as well. I will be taking notes while you are providing comments. If you see me looking down, it is because I am typing. And one final administrative note, please remember that we will have individuals with opposing views providing public comment today. The only thing I ask is that you be courteous and respectful to each other. Agenda item 2, general public comment on matters other than the previously listed LCB file number. Comments will be limited to 2 minutes per person. Is anyone interested in providing public comment about a matter not on the agenda? If so, please identify yourself either by raising your hand on screen, clicking the raise hand button in Zoom, or indicating in the chat. Once I call on you, please identify yourself and spell your name for the record. I will then start my timer and we'll let you know when your 2 minutes expires. At this time, is there anyone interested in providing general public comment on a matter not related to an item on the agenda? I see a question in the chat about the phone number to call. On the agenda, there was a phone number. I will go ahead and copy that into the chat as well for you. One moment, please. Ms. Cece, is it my understanding that you intend to make a public comment on a matter not related to an item on the agenda? The one question I received in the chat, again from Val, the question is when is the last date when written comment may be submitted? So if you want to have it considered for today, the 12th is the last day. If you want to have it considered prior to the adoption hearing, it is actually the 26th of August. So really by about 8 a.m. So that I can at the very least review by that point your written comment prior to the adoption hearing at 10. Again, the sooner the better, so that I can discuss your recommendations with the secretary and we can discuss any possible amendments. Okay, we will give Cece a quick moment to get to her phone so she can make a public comment. Mr. Parks, good afternoon.
Hello, Mark. For the record, Bruce Parks, B-R-U-C-E-P-A-R-K-S, Chairman of the Washoe County Republican Party Central Committee. It's my observation, based on the last workshop that we had, the majority of the public input was largely ignored. I don't know if that's the correct term, but it certainly wasn't incorporated into the regulations that were adopted. I was just wondering if the sentiment that I'm hearing from the people I represent, that these hearings are simply an opportunity for the Secretary of State to check the block saying, yes, we allowed public comment, but then the Secretary of State's office largely just does what they want to do anyway. Please assure us that that's not the case, sir.
Mr. Parks, thank you for your commentary. I will let you know there have been a number of actually really valid points that have been brought up in our written feedback that we've received via email already. So I think some of those topics we will discuss today. I think it's very likely that we'll bring those topics up. And I think you will very likely see, again, I can't speak for the secretary and the decisions that she makes, but I think there are some very valid points that she will absolutely consider prior to the adoption hearing. Ms. Cece, are you on the phone yet by any chance? Well, Ms. Cece, there is a second general public comment at the end of the workshop today, so that your comments, again, not related to an item on the public or the agenda, we'll be able to accept them then as well. Perfect. Thank you. At this time, we'll close public comment. So general public comment is now closed. Agenda item 3. Before we begin the workshop, I'm going to provide a brief introduction to the workshop process. One moment while I pull up my slides. Okay. So first of all, we're going to talk about two things real quick as part of this introduction to the workshop process. Then it will stop and we'll start up the next agenda item, which covers the beginning of the workshop. And really the point of this introduction to the workshop process is to simply highlight that there are multiple types of regulations and to make sure that everyone is on the same page regarding the specific type of regulations that we are discussing today. Those of you that were involved previously in our regulatory workshops and adoption hearings earlier this year may remember that those were permanent regulations, and the Secretary of State under 293-247 has a requirement to put permanent regulations relating to an election in place prior to the last day of February of the year of an election. This regulation that we're going to discuss today is not a permanent regulation. Again, permanent regulations have requirements for workshops, there's an adoption hearing, and then a subsequent, they ultimately go to the Legislative Commission for review, discussion, and approval. And again, that is not what we are doing today. There's another type of regulation you may have heard about called emergency regulations. This is a regulation under a different portion of NRS 233B. An emergency regulation does not have an adoption hearing, does not have workshops. And from what again, really goes right to the governor's desk for a signature. This is not an emergency regulation either. This is a temporary regulation. A temporary regulation, again, has yet another section of the statute that it ultimately relates to. This is a regulation that has a defined period of time. This regulation, we'll talk about the timeline here on this next slide. Again, ultimately will expire unless put into place as a permanent regulation. So the timeline specifically for this regulation that we are talking about today is the workshop. Again, very much intended to be a discussion about the regulation specifically. And as I mentioned before, if there are other questions about election processes, other things relating to the 2022 election cycle, again, I'm eager to discuss them, but in a different forum. This simply isn't that time. And we'll be able to arrange time later. We'll receive, again, public comment, both written and oral. Like I mentioned, we've already received 19 emails in writing about the regulation. We'll continue to do so, not only in relation to this workshop, but also in relation to the adoption hearing that is coming up on August 26th. You'll notice, again, that one is at 10 a.m., so not in the afternoon like this one is. Following the adoption hearing on August 26th, the statute explains that for a temporary regulation to go into effect, it actually is not allowed to be filed with the Secretary of State until 35 days after the date the temporary regulation was adopted by the agency. Now, this might be a bit confusing because in this case, the Secretary of State is both proposing a temporary regulation and then also will be the filing agent for that regulation after 35 days. But I put that on here to simply highlight that, again, pursuant to the statute, after the adoption hearing on the 26th, we will not formally file it until the 35th day later, which is September 30th, which will mean that this temporary regulation will be in effect from September 30th of 2022 to November 1st of 2023. Again, that's also, there's the statute, so you can see the reference there as well. With the exception being that unless we put it through the permanent regulatory process that we remember from before with the workshops, adoption hearings, and ultimately going to Legislative Commission for it to be adopted. Okay. Get back to where I am at. There we are. Okay, so now we're going to move on to agenda item 4, the workshop regarding temporary regulation T002-22. I have another very brief presentation to address some concerns and questions that have been raised before we get into our discussion. And this time, and I apologize, I should have asked this before. If it's not showing the right portion of the presentation, please let me know and I can switch that around real quick.
Oh, we're not seeing anything.
Oh, one moment, please. Sorry. How about,
Yeah,
is it the PowerPoint or is it this kind of 2-slide looking thing?
it has a seal for our country, Nevada State of Secretary of State.
Excellent. Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much. So it does not have the slide 1 of 9. Excellent. Okay. Let me move ahead to, perfect, this portion. Thank you. Okay. So why are we here? I think is the most important part to start when talking about this regulation today. Well, this is really, again, and it has been part of our continued review and improvement of all election processes and procedures. This is not a unique or independent thing. You all remember, again, many of you, I believe, again, we reviewed our permanent regulations earlier this year. That process, the permanent regulatory review, is something that we are going to begin again this coming January to capture changes that need to occur in our regulations to make them better, to increase security and transparency following the lessons learned from the 2022 election cycle. We also continue, and this is, again, just examples of the things that we're working on across the state as election officials, reviewing all training materials for poll workers, right? These things are not set in stone. We recognize that there's nuance and ways to improve, and we continue to do so. We continue to prepare for contingencies. We're watching for power outages, wildfires, and winter storms, considering what would happen every time there's a flash flood in Douglas County or a fire in Elko. We think to ourselves, if this happened on election day, what would we do? How would we react if 80 or 93 were blocked by fire? What would we do to ensure that voters are able to get to the polls one way or the other? We continue to review, and this is something, of course, that many of you personally have raised to me, and address concerns about transparency and security. I will tell you that everything that we do nowadays is viewed through the lens of transparency and security improvements. How can we ensure that your vote counts and it is not diluted by an illegal vote? How can we ensure that you have transparency and the ability to understand and to see the multitude of different phases and parts of an election? From start to finish, so that you understand the process and so that you can also provide scrutiny on it. These are all things that we continue to look at. And over the last year, almost two, there's been a lot of discussion at the national and state level about hand count tabulations. Well, as you all well know, NRS 293B-050 talks about the authorization for use of mechanical voting systems. That statute specifically calls out that ballots or votes may be cast, registered, and recorded and counted by means of a mechanical voting system. It does not require it. So why is that a problem? Well, again, arguably, and many of you have argued, it isn't a problem. But previously, until this regulation was proposed, there was no standardized process. So election officials, all 17 across our state, were expected to, if they were going to conduct a hand count tabulation, make their own process and templates, conduct their own research. And keep in mind now, we spent about a year of conducting research relating to this regulation, talking to numerous other jurisdictions and getting into discussions and asking for templates, looking out, seeking best practices to understand how other states and jurisdictions do it. But again, without a regulation like this, county election officials would be expected to do all of this on their own, keeping in mind, this is the full scope of requirements specific to election administration that your county election officials have to be good at. Whether they want to or not, whether they have other things on their plate, this circle here describes exactly the things that your county election officials have to be cognizant of and paying attention to. Now, keep in mind also, right, 2 of our county election officials, the registrars, are really privileged to be able to focus only on this. And the other 15, this is just one slice of the pie of the duties and responsibilities that they owe to their constituents. In some cases, public administrator, in other cases, clerk of the court. But again, all of this for the 15 counties that are not a registrar, again, this is really just one part of their responsibilities. So also, when we were doing our research over the last year about hand count tabulations, I will tell you that we identified some significant and very interesting information relating to historic cheating and human error. This was something that across the board, from the jurisdictions that we talked to, that they stressed there is significant risk for human error. There's the possibility of cheating. And these jurisdictions told us, here's how we figured out how to overcome it. In many cases, they said, look, you're going to want to do A, B, and C. After you do that, you're going to realize that D, E, and F work better. But then you're going to realize that really G, H, and I are really the ways you need to get to. That's what we wanted to find out. We wanted to identify those best practices and then again, apply them based on our statutes and our administrative code. Just to get it on the record, the states that were most helpful in providing information to us, Arizona, Idaho, Kansas, and New Hampshire. We got a number of questions about California, and I verified again this morning. One, California did not provide any information, in part because they don't conduct hand counts in any jurisdiction in California in any way, shape, or form. So additionally, there were no reporting requirements to the secretary or to the public for that matter when it relates to hand counts, again, until this regulation. There was no identification of the costs of voters. There's no clarification on the process, or the locations or how it would work, or contingency planning. When I talk about contingency planning, of course, I'm referring to the canvass deadline under 293-387. It says that the Board of County Commissioners or Supervisors have to canvass the vote by the 10th day after the election. What happens if a hand count takes longer? Again, it's probably not appropriate, using the 2022 general election as an example, to contemplate that on the evening of November 18th. Similarly, there's a recount timeline that's different, so that even if a county were able to, on their own, conduct a hand count tabulation within the prescribed time so that the canvass could still occur, there's a different recount timeline. Under 293-405, it says that a recount must begin within 5 days and must be completed within 5 days. So how does that work? And what happens if you can do it in the first place, but not the second? And keeping in mind now, 293-404 says that during a recount, the ballots must be recounted in the manner they were originally counted. So again, there are all these different aspects to counting and tabulation that we thought about, that we looked at the examples of best practices, and that we combined into these proposed regulations. And I will tell you, as I mentioned earlier, that there was some feedback that we received that highlighted things that again could continue to build upon these regulations. And frankly, that's why I'm very happy to have the people on this call today that we have. It tells me that you're dedicated to elections, that you're interested in elections, and that many of you, again, have really good ideas on how we can continue to approve these proposed regulations, to continue to maintain a high standard, to continue to maintain transparency and security across our elections in Nevada, regardless of again, the manner in which they are conducted. So this regulation, it does leave the conduct of the hand count to the discretion of the county clerk and registrars in coordination with their county commissioners and supervisors. These processes can be fiscally intense. They can require time. By requiring the coordination with the county commissioners, again, the secretary is saying, we want you, county clerk, to have the support of your county commissioners so that they agree and are aware of the fiscal requirements and provide backing to, in some cases, get additional workers. It establishes a high bar of security and transparency. And I am truly excited to talk to you today about the multitude of ways that we incorporated those best practices to address some very specific, really methods of accidental human error or even deliberate cheating. And then it standardizes the process. This will also ultimately only help going forward. We have a number of individuals that move between Douglas and Carson, Washoe, Story, Lyon, Nye, Clark, and vice versa. Having a standardized practice will enable voters to move from one jurisdiction to another, one county to another, and still be able to participate without having a new, unique county method in every county they go to. By doing so, again, an individual that is involved in a hand count, conceivably in Nye County, that moves to White Pine, will be able to walk in on day one and say, I know how to do this. I'm familiar with the regulations. I've done this before. I'm going to be the one who's going to be the reading clerk. That's what I did previously, and I'm good at it. And it's going to expedite the process. And that familiarity is only going to help increase the efficiencies across the board. There are other topics, again, that I suspect will come up today, and I don't want to belabor the point, but I'm certainly excited to talk about them. Stop that. And then finally, before public comment is opened up on this temporary regulation, I would like to read into record a summary of the proposed changes. Existing law requires the Secretary of State to adopt regulations establishing uniform statewide standards for counting of vote cast using certain methods of voting, and authorizes the Secretary of State to adopt regulations for counting votes cast using certain types of mechanical voting systems. This regulation sets forth various requirements for hand counting of the ballots. Section 7 of this regulation defines the term hand count. Sections 2 and 9 of this regulation authorize a county or city clerk in consultation with the governing body of the county or city to conduct a hand count of the ballots voted in an election. Sections 3 and 10 of this regulation require a county or city clerk who is going to conduct a hand count to submit to the Secretary of State 30 days before the election a plan for the hand count, which must include certain procedures for conducting the hand count, plans for the location and the necessary equipment, and personnel for the hand count. plans ensuring the security of the hand count, and contingency plans to meet certain deadlines. Sections 4 and 11 of this regulation require a county or city clerk to conducting a hand count to establish a sufficient number of hand count tally teams, which must consist of at least 4 election board officers who must not be of all the same political party. Sections 5 and 12 of this regulation set forth the procedures required to tally the votes during the hand count. Sections 6 and 13 of this regulation, 1, set forth certain requirements for the writing devices used by the hand count tally team, and 2, prohibit the hand count tally team members from bringing their own writing devices into the physical location where the ballots will be hand counted. Just to clarify the duplication there, sections 2 and 9, 3 and 11, 3 and 10, again, that there's a section devoted to county clerks, and then another section that's related to 293C, which relates specifically to city clerks as well. That's why there's that seemingly duplication.
We can't see anything on the screen again.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Oh, there we go. Apologize, it's just me now.
Okay.
So along those lines, and recognizing that, again, your input is the reason we are here. At this time, I will open public comment on proposed temporary regulation T002-22. If at this time you are interested in providing public comment, please go ahead and indicate so. Again, either physically holding your hand up, you can click, there's a raise hand feature on Zoom, or again, you can type into the chat if you'd like to provide a comment. I will ask again that if you are on Zoom, please hold off in using the chat feature so that I can identify individuals who are trying to make a comment, and we will follow up in that regard. Okay, Mr. Parks, good afternoon, please.
Thank you again, Mark. 3 questions. How binding are these regulations? In other words, when a new Secretary of State takes over, can all these regulations be rescinded or revised? Second question, what does the county do when they don't actually have a voter registrar on record? They only have an interim voter register. Arguably, that would invalidate the entire process. Third question, I am in complete and total befuddlement why the state dictates to the counties how they will conduct their elections. Imagine a world where we vote at the precinct level and then the ballots are counted at the closing of the polls, and you have immediate results before midnight that night. Of course, that would require that you don't open up early voting 2 or 3 months in advance of, 2 or 3 weeks in advance of the actual election day. This seems to be a top-down approach instead of a bottoms-up approach, as it should be. I understand your chart and all the hysteria about the myriad duties and responsibilities. That's all invalidated. Every bit of that is completely invalidated if we do not go with the centralization of our voting process. If we do it at the precinct level on election day, hand counted by the Republican and Democrat for that precinct at close of polls at that location. You have all your results before the next business day. And I would also, there's commentary about regulation 293-363, paragraph B. That seems to me that it would disenfranchise voters entirely. They're going to turn their back and draw out a certain number of ballots and then declare them as null and void. Seriously? Anyway, my comments, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Parks. The one part of that I think that I might be able to address that pertain to this regulation specifically, and Mr. Greg Ott, if you may help me in this one. The question specifically is the new reg binding for past the change in administration. My understanding that would be, but perhaps Mr. Ott, if you're able to provide.
Certainly, Mark. Greg Ott with the Office of the Attorney General. So I think what I understood Mr. Parks to say is, could these regulations be modified by a future Secretary of State? And the answer to that would be yes. Temporary regulations, as Mark explained earlier, have a specific time frame, so they lapse by operation of law anyway. But just as this Secretary of State has the ability to amend or modify or adopt regulations, that power then passes to the next Secretary of State. So he or she would then have the power of that office when they take over.
Thank you, Mr. Ott. I appreciate the explanation, but as we have seen in the state of Nevada, laws, regulations, or other things that are supposed to sunset often have to be taken to the Supreme Court to have that action actually take place.
Mr. Parks, thank you for your commentary. We'll take it into consideration for sure.
I guess I should add one other thing, Mark, that I think
Please.
Court touched on something you mentioned earlier. The NRS section that Mr. Parks referred to is NRS 293-363. That is a statute, not a regulation. So whether or not the Secretary agrees with it, she is powerless to change that statute. That's not something that the legislature has delegated to her.
Again, thank you, Mr. Ott, for the clarification. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Again, just a reminder to everybody, the chat is so that I can see if somebody is interested in identifying that they want to talk, and please not for general commentary. Ms. Thomas, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. I wanted to ask if you received my comments that I submitted earlier in the week to your office.
Yes, ma'am. If you submitted them prior, we've been keeping a close eye out for everyone's commentary. Absolutely.
Okay, great. So I just am going to highlight some of the things I made in those comments. Just most of it was kind of grammatical type of stuff that could be changed to shorten up some of the verbiage and have better meaning and clarification. I was mostly interested in making sure that all personal items are nowhere near these counting areas. That might help solve the issue with the personal writing utensils, that if, backpacks, purses, and cell phones are all completely in a different area, then and maybe that's something that the secretary could address so that it is uniform in all counties. Also, I think a section needs to be added for the counting of the VVPAT ballots. Historically, those are backup copies for the electronic machines. However, that is the piece of paper that voters are verifying. That is the piece of paper voters are casting, saying this is what is true. Voters do not have the ability to state what is on those thumb drives is true. So it is another form. It could, granted, be labor intensive, but it is the valid ballot, paper ballot on those electronic machines that voters have cast, and they are printed out and they can be used in a backup scenario where the thumb drives fail. However, there's nothing to say that they can't be used as the primary counting method for the electronic machines as well. And then again, more of it just being added to. I do appreciate that the Secretary of State wants to provide a form that makes it standard throughout the counties, much like the form to register as a voter is standard and issued by the state. So I understand that. And then also just that little, how you were trying to describe, it is kind of funny to me that you were trying to tell people how to tally. You strike a line through the fifth line through the first 4 bars. I think in your text that you're saying to do that line horizontal. I could see those lines bleeding into the next group of lines. So I have always seen a practice where you take the line, kind of at an angle from the top of the very first left bar down to the bottom of that. And I think that would help clear up any confusion that possibly could happen. let's see. I think that's all I'm assuming that you looked at all the grammatical things that I put. And then I think it should be clarified as well that all of your tally forms are going to be organized in a tally book. You kept using that term interchangeably. So for clarification, that might help. That's all I have.
Thank you, Ms. Thomas. Excellent points too, and we'll definitely take those into consideration. And to address your comments, again, even the detail with the type of tally mark was something that, again, numerous jurisdictions said, if you don't clarify, then someone's going to do it 100 different ways, and then if you try to compare, it makes it extremely complicated. So I appreciate you noting that detail. And similarly, with the standardization of forms, you're absolutely right. The form to register to vote is standardized by the Secretary of State. In fact, if you look through NRS 293 or NAC 293, there are 19 specific forms that must be prescribed by the Secretary of State in those two chapters alone. So yes, ma'am, I appreciate that. And great catch on the forms versus books. That also, yes, will be addressed. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Camp, can you hear me? Your turn, please. Perfect. You're off mute, sir, but I can't hear you. Mr. Camp, we can try again in a few moments. Please keep troubleshooting though, and we'll make sure.
Did you call me? I don't know what you're waiting for. This is
Oh, I'm
Val.
sorry. I'm trying to, Mr. Camp. I'm trying. It says I have to ask to unmute your phone. It won't let me unmute your number on my own. We'll keep troubleshooting, and then Mr. Camp, I'll come back to you. I absolutely promise that we will not finish before we're able to talk. All voting is local is next. Please state your name and spell it for the record, please.
Good afternoon. My name is Carrie Dermick. I'm the Nevada State Director for All Voting is Local, an organization that exists to expose and dismantle threats to voter freedom, to make voting safe, fair, and accessible, to build a democracy for us all. Nevadans believe the freedom to vote must belong to us all. Our state has increased voter participation by making it more accessible to vote, by expanding access to voter registration and increased voting options. In order to protect Nevadans and their votes, we urge the Secretary of State to issue regulations prohibiting the use of hand counts as the primary method of counting ballots due to the potential violations of state law. These potential violations include failing to meet minimum accuracy standards set by state law and hand counting procedures, violating Nevada voters' constitutional right to have their vote accurately counted and their elections fairly resolved. These violations are explained at length in the letters sent by the Brennan Center for Justice, All Voting is Local, ACLU of Nevada, and Silver State Voices. In addition to the possible violations of state law, hand counting ballots is costly. Counting tens of thousands of ballots is not time efficient, which again jeopardizes certification, and the cost of labor to do this is high, and it will be at the cost of taxpayers. And the chances of error actually increase with hand counting. All Voting is Local Nevada continues to support the use of electronic voting machines, which are accurate, quicker to tabulate, and ADA accessible. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Ermick. We'll take your comments into consideration. Ms. Benson, good afternoon.
Hi there, Mark. How are you?
Doing well, thank you. How are you?
That was weird.
Should I go? Is that muted?
Yes, ma'am. I think that's better.
Okay, sorry about that. Well, hello, for the record, this is Alita Benson, Executive Director, speaking on behalf of the Nevada Republican Party. Just wanted to provide some feedback on specific regulations and suggestions for improvement to ensure all paper and mail ballots receive equal treatment, no matter the county. Our goal, whatever the election rule, whether we agree with it or not, we want it to be applied to all counties equally. And overall, many of the processes that were laid out to ensure accurate and transparent counting of the ballots in these regulations are to be applauded. So thank you for that. We had a few areas of concern on 4 specific sections. So in section 5.4b, this regulation would limit the ballots being counted to 20 per stack. In Clark County, ballots that are returned by mail, which are paper, are counted in batches ranging from 249 to 10. The average mail tray size to process paper ballots returned by mail is 200. So if the regulation is applied to every county processing paper ballots returned to the election official for tabulation, we have no issue with it. If it's being applied inconsistently and the paper ballots in Clark are allowed to be processed in batches of any size, while other counties are held to batches of 20 for their paper ballots, that seems like an arbitrary standard. If the appointed registrar of voters in Clark County is allowed to set his ballot batch sizes, we would hope the elected clerks of every other county should be allowed to do so as well. In section 1.3.7b, this states that a full list of election board officers shall be provided to the Secretary of State. We would ask that this list be provided to the public for all counties. Clark County has refused to answer Freedom of Information Act requests for the lists of election board workers in Clark County, most recently in July of 2022. If this information is provided, we would hope all counties that are processing paper ballots submitted by mail, they also shall provide the full list of election board officers when requested. Section 6.2, prohibiting the use of personal writing devices, is an excellent regulation. Currently, this is not imposed in Clark County, where the county board officers are allowed to bring in their own writing utensils and devices, most of which write in blue or black ink. The writing devices provided by the county are also in blue or black ink. If this regulation is imposed on paper ballots counted by hand, we would expect that it will also be imposed on all processes where paper ballots being submitted by mail are counted. If mail ballots have a different standard and black and blue pens of all shapes and sizes are allowed, we'd like to know why this double standard is acceptable, because we don't think it is, but really like that regulation. And finally, in section 5.4.e.3, there's a requirement to announce the tally every 5th vote. In NRS 293.285, the election board officer is required to announce the name of the registered voter. We had poll watchers, we had poll workers in the 2022 primary election, and the requirement to announce voters was applied haphazardly. In my own experience, this was not completed at the Meadows Mall polling location in Las Vegas, which is one of the highest volume voting locations. If there's no priority to ensure consistency in the application of the existing statutes, it wasn't really clear why this regulation is being added. And we would hope that the treatment for each voter at each polling location should be consistent no matter where they vote. That's it. Thank you for your time, and we hope that you'll consider and implement the suggestions given, so that way all counties have the same rules for processing paper ballots.
Thank you, Ms. Benson. A couple of comments, and I think I apologize. This is probably my fault for not clarifying. When we talked about the batch size, really what I'm referring to is, and this was one of the best practices that we heard across the country, right? When you have your 4 individuals on the tally team, and you have a batch of 20 ballots that they're going through, the intent was really to identify errors in a batch of 20 as opposed to going through 100, not as a means to limit, but again, the way the process is envisioned is you'll have your reading clerk and your verification clerk, right? The reading clerk is looking at the ballot and going down, Governor Smith, 1, Lieutenant Governor Jones, 1. The 2 tally clerks are sitting adjacent to each other, again, at the same table. And the idea is that you go through an entire ballot as the 2 clerks go down that entire tally sheet. And then you go down essentially just 20 ballots at a time. And then you do your verification. One of the best practices that we heard was that some jurisdictions tried to do 100 ballots at a time. And then if you got to the bottom of 100 and the 2 tally clerks compared notes essentially to make sure that the 2 tallies were accurate. And oh, by the way, that those are 2. So it's not go through this entire process once and then go through the whole process again. But by having 2 tally clerks, you're doing it twice at once. But if you, as you're going through that batch, if you go through 100 ballots, and then the 2 tally clerks look at each other and kind of compare notes under the keen eye of the verification clerk. If they go, oh, wait a minute, you got 5 for that guy and 4 for, I got 4 for that guy. Then you have to go through 100 ballots to try to figure out where that discrepancy is or what error was made, or maybe even do them all over. Whereas as we heard from, again, these best practices, limiting it to 20, again, doesn't slow the process down. It simply makes it more manageable chunks so that you get to 20, you verify down the line, everything's consistent. Yep, good, keep moving, so that you can find efficiencies. Similarly, and again, I think this is in a nomenclature, and I'll need to clarify that. The list of individuals, the provision in this regulation wasn't intended to identify who's involved in a count necessarily. Really, what we had heard was that from a public transparency point of view, the jurisdictions that conduct hand counts across the country have said that there are groups that are willing to reach out and help, that will provide training and guidance and assistance. And when we heard that, we thought, well, here in Nevada, if there's an organization that's going to provide training or guidance or assistance in some relation to an election, then we want to know who it is. We want to be able to identify that, exactly like you said, to the public, so that there's, again, increased transparency. We were not intending to have that be the specific names of the individuals involved in that process. Though, as you mentioned, there is an expectation for transparency in that regard as well, separately. We talked about the standardized writing devices, and I think you also highlighted something that we've picked up on. In our research and discussions about hand count tabulations, we realized, again, rightly so, and this is part of, again, your election officials across our state coming at this with a very keen eye, creatively thinking, what's changed in the environment? What's changed in our processes and procedures over the last 4 years? Simple fact of the matter is again, we now have an increased number of paper ballots that are being used. Some, again, I'm talking about mail ballots, of course. This was one area where the method for human error and the opportunity for cheating, it certainly reared its head in a way that we hadn't really anticipated. The discussion about standardized writing devices absolutely will be incorporated into future discussions for permanent regulations, because for the exact reason that you highlighted, that there's an important need to have that standardization across the board. And then lastly, that fifth vote verification piece too. Again, if you can picture, you've got your verification clerk and your reading clerk standing next to each other, reading clerk reading the ballot, verification clerk looking over his shoulder to make sure that he or she is reading it properly and not creating extra votes where none existed, and your two tally clerks. The idea behind identifying the fifth vote was that as they go down through the stack of 20 ballots, moving their way down, over time, an individual is going to hit that fifth horizontal check mark for Jones for governor. This is his fifth vote. And the idea, it would simply look like, again, the reader going, Governor Jones, 1, and then them going, oh, that's my fifth one. Is that your fifth one? All right, keep going. That's it. And then, Lieutenant Governor Smith, 1, Secretary of State, something, oh, that's my fifth one for him too. You didn't get the fifth one? Okay, now we got to go back and again through those 20 to identify. So again, apologize for not making that more clear in the language of the regulation, but that really is what the intent was, and we'll certainly take your comments into consideration and look at how we can try to improve that going forward.
Yeah, no, the intent was clear. I mean, it's easier to count 20 than 100. We just want the same rule for all counties. That's it. We just want it to be standard.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Camp, good afternoon.
How's that? Is that working?
Yes, sir.
All right, great. Thank you very much for the opportunity to make these comments. It sounds to me from the tone of the conversation that the Secretary of State is going to go forward with regulations in some form, no matter the outcome of this. Just for those that may not be aware, my background is in accounting and controllership and in forensic audit. And in many situations, when you're implementing a new system, you do a parallel process. And our intention in Nye County would be to do a parallel process because we would go to 100% paper ballots, either through the mail-in or filling them out on site and using tabulators, and then use a parallel process implementing a hand count procedure as I've envisioned. So my feeling is that by using a tabulation process for all of the votes, if I do a parallel hand count process, and that should be only a validating and testing of the process, and that the regulations of imposed here would not apply to me because I would be doing the tabulation process that was already envisioned by the Secretary of the NRS and the NAC. But should we go forward with this and say that I have to comply in both regards, both with the tabulation process and the hand count, here are my comments regarding the individual items in the regulation. Starting with section 2.2 and section 2, paragraph 4, we need to provide forms to us. My feeling is that the Secretary of State should specify the basic elements of the tally forms, and particularly since Nye County is going to be the guinea pig here, let's be realistic about this. We are developing ballot tally sheets that will include elements of the hash mark and totals by contest. The tally document should be sent to the Secretary of State for verification of the elements needed to ensure control and accuracy of the count and to ensure there is proper approval of the count by the reading clerk and the verification clerk. And I have already incorporated the terminology that you're using. The process review should be like the approval of ballots currently required by the Secretary of State. The ballot design is the responsibility of the clerk with the approval of the SOS. Tally forms are critical to the batch documentation and the method of summarizing the batch tally forms. The design is integral to the control process established by the clerk. We strongly urge the Secretary of State to not adopt these regulations. If the Secretary of State moves forward with these temporary regulations, and since the process requires review and approval by the Secretary of State prior to execution, the Secretary of State should be defining the required elements, but not the form and the process to be followed. Item number, section 3, paragraph 4, the requirement to the physical locations and the scale diagram depicting the planned setup of the location. The NRS currently establishes the security of the voting booth, but not the positioning of the check-in process or where the voting booths are to be positioned. I am unaware of any requirement for a scale diagram of the physical layout that needs to be provided for any other electronic voting or tabulation process. Strongly urge the Secretary of State to not adopt these temporary regulations. If you so choose to do that, you should establish the elements of control that should be in place, but the actual layout should be up to the individual clerk. Section 3, item 6. The plans for the observation of the hand count by the members of the public in accordance with section 1 of LCB file number R108-21 refers to NRS 293B.353. And let me read just the first sentence. The county clerk shall no later than April 15th of each year in which the general election is held, submit to the Secretary of State for approval a written plan for the accommodation of the members of the general public to observe the delivery, counting, and handling and processing of ballots at the polling place, receiving center, and central counting place. The problem with this is this requirement is impossible to meet if the clerk wants to do a hand count for the 2022 election cycle, since the deadline for submission is passed and invalidates the need for this temporary regulation. It would not affect future elections since this temporary regulation would only be in effect till November 1st, 2023. So by this section 3, paragraph 6 alone, referring to 293B.354, invalidates the entire hand count process because we would not be able to comply with this section. Section 3, paragraph 8. A list of any outside vendors hired or who may be hired to consult or assist in the preparation or operation of the hand count. Again, we strongly urge the Secretary of State to not adopt these temporary regulations. This requirement appears to be unique for this regulation. Does this apply to other aspects of the election process? Is a paid poll worker considered an outside vendor? I am currently unaware, I'm new on the job here, so I'm currently unaware of any other reporting of vendors used by the clerks for other aspects of the process. Mail pre-sort, ballots, sample ballot printers, ballot stock vendors. If this is within the general budget of the clerk and the Board of Commissioners has approved that budget, this should be of no concern to the Secretary of State. Section 4, paragraph 1C. 2 election board officers known as tally clerks to separately record the votes in the appropriate tally book. The process envisioned by the Nye County will involve 3 tally clerks as a key control in the tally process. The tally will need to match for all 3 tally clerks. While the Secretary of State may establish as a minimum, the clerk should be free to establish a process that incorporates basic principles of internal control. Since a double count is required of the ballots, this would materially increase the number of full-time equivalents needed to ensure tally accuracy for Nye County. This also refers to a tally book and refers to a tally form. Using a book will require additional process to transfer the tally forms totals to the process for recording the batch totals and summarizing the results by precinct. Again, we strongly urge the Secretary of State to not adopt these temporary regulations. The Secretary of State should only specify the elements of control, but not the form. And that is pretty much the way it's been with the NRS up to this date. Section 4, paragraph 3, item B, must wear medical style exam gloves at all time while working his or her shift. This is reference to the reader that's reading the ballots. Medical style exam gloves appear to be required here to avoid any ability to mark ballots by the reading clerk. Medical style exam gloves are uncomfortable over long periods of time and for some people create an allergic reaction. Most likely this requirement is in place because election workers in an isolated instance who handled ballots were caught marking ballots with graphite stub under their fingernail. This is not a requirement for those handling mail-in ballots. If this is a requirement for the reading clerk for this temporary regulation, then anyone who touches a ballot anywhere along the process should also be required to wear gloves. To single this out for the reading clerk, who will be reading the ballot under observation by the verification clerk and the general public, is overreach. While we strongly urge the Secretary of State to not adopt these temporary regulations, should this requirement stay in place, then the clerk should be able to submit the type of gloves to be used and could be some other type of material other than latex. The Secretary of State should not single out the hand count process and under equal application of the law, impose similar requirements for all mail-in ballot handling from the opening of envelopes up to the tabulation process. Additionally, this will be difficult to monitor and enforce. Section 5, paragraph 3. A hand count of ballots must be tallied not less than 2 times by the hand count tally team for each contest on the ballot that will be hand counted. The result of each tally of the ballots for each contest must match exactly. If the results do not match, the hand count must be conducted again until the results match one of the previous tally. The requirement to tally ballots twice will double the cost to the county by doubling the full-time equivalents. The double counting process will double the time to count the ballots. While this may work in a very small county, it will be a burden on Nye County and significantly increase our costs. No regulation established by the Secretary of State should increase the burden to the county if the county clerk can show that the controls established are effective. Nye County would recommend 3 talliers. If their count matches, the reading and verification clerk will verify the counts on all 3 tally documents and approve the match. If there is a mismatch in an individual race, we will use a recount tally sheet to recount just the mismatch rate until a match of all 3 talliers is achieved. Again, we strongly urge the Secretary of State to not adopt these temporary regulations. This requirement does have an economic impact on the public, as it would materially increase the cost to the public and thereby have an adverse effect contrary to item number 4 per your statements pursuant to NRS 233B.0603. Next item, section 5, paragraph 4B. The ballots must be divided in separate stacks containing 20 ballots per stack. Each stack must be read and tallied separately. The requirement to establish the number of ballots in a batch should be established by the county. The county clerk takes on the responsibility for the accuracy and timeliness of the count. In our case, this would increase the time it takes to count the ballots by nearly 500%. A 250% increase in the number of batches to be counted and double count of the batches. With a voter turnout of around 30,000 voters in Nye County, the Secretary of State process would require 3,000 individual tally processes, 1,500 batches to be counted twice, assembled and tracked with 1,500 ballot tracking documents. Now, some batches will be less than the desired batch size to complete the count of a precinct. Nye County process envisioned would involve 50 ballots per batch with 3 tally clerks. Our process would involve approximately 1,600 batches to be counted, assembled, and tracked with 600 ballot tracking documents. Obviously, a large difference from the 1,500 batches and the 3,000 additional individual tallies. In addition, these batches will need to be summarized by precinct by contest and further summarized to determine a precinct level count by race. A 250% increase in the batches for Nye County would increase the number of entries into the precinct level batch totals that need to be tracked, entered, and summarized to achieve a total precinct level contest vote total. We strongly urge the Secretary of State to not adopt these temporary regulations, as this requirement would significantly increase the number of full-time equivalent workers to conduct the hand count. This requirement does have an economic impact on the public, as it would materially increase the cost of the public and therefore have an adverse effect contrary to item number 4 per your statements pursuant to NRS 233B.0603. Section 4.5, paragraph 4D. After reading each ballot, the reading clerk shall lay the ballot face down on the table and distinguish the counted ballot from the uncounted ballots. After each stack of ballots are counted, the ballots must be tied with a string or bound with a paper clip or binder clip, a stack of 20 ballots. But these are similar concerns here, and as far as the size of the batch of ballots and the extra cost of counting and the number of ballots to be tracked with batch control procedures.
A lot of people are leaving.
Section 5, paragraph 4E.
I lost him.
No, Mr. Camp, sorry about that. 1 second. I was trying to mute somebody else and I inadvertently muted you. Sorry, Marianne, I'm gonna have to mute you. Mr. Camp, would you mind hitting *6 again, sir, please? Mr.
I
Camp?
thought you were trying to cut me off.
Oh, no. That was a very pregnant 2 minutes, and I apologize, but I know, again.
That's good. That's
understand
good. I'm getting
your
close to
interest in
being
wanting
done,
to
so we're good here.
One moment,
Okay.
please. Let me make sure everyone else is muted. I just want to be able to afford you the same respect we got everybody else. Okay, yes, sir. Please continue. I apologize. And I'm looking down at the document that you provided as well and following along. You were on right at the point after the tally
Section
books.
5, paragraph 4E.
4E.
Again, this refers to the tally the votes in the appropriate tally book, depending on whether the ballot has been cast in a primary or general election. If the election is a primary election, which won't apply to this temporary regulation in any form, the tally vote should be noted in the tally book for the applicable political party or nonpartisan tally book. My comments are the tally books are a key control in the batch control process and totaling the votes by precinct by contest. Secretary of State should specify the elements of the tally process, but not specify the form. The method of totaling tally form should be up to the clerk with the approval of the SOS if necessary. Again, we strongly urge to not adopt these temporary regulations. Now, here's the kicker. Section 5, paragraph 4E3. For every 5th vote for the same candidate or ballot question, place a horizontal hash mark through the previous 4 perpendicular hash marks. One of the tally clerks shall then clearly announce the 5th vote throughout the course of the tally, the total number of hash marks for each candidate or ballot question. If the tally clerks agree on the total number of hash marks for each candidate or ballot question after the total has been announced pursuant to paragraph E, the tally clerk shall make a mark above the 5 hash marks to indicate that the count of both tally clerks match. If the count of the tally clerks matches, the tally may continue. Does not match, the reason for the discrepancy must be identified and corrected before the hand count tally team. Now, let me make sure I reemphasize what it said here. The 5th vote. not ballot, but it says fifth vote. So this requirement imposes an incredible undue burden and is only intended to slow down the count process and make a hand count untenable. This will only serve to create disruption in the process, causing readers to lose track of where they are in the count and create rather than eliminate error. Example, if there are, just use for simple math here, 40 candidates on the ballot for a multiple contest, the tally clerks could potentially have to stop up to 160 times in a 20 ballot batch to announce every fifth vote for a candidate. Since there is a double count of each batch, that's up to 320 stops for 20 ballot batch. While the 5 hash mark grouping is acceptable, the process of stopping for each candidate after 5 marks will truly increase the cost and make the process exponentially longer to complete. And when you're doing 30,000 ballots, that's potentially over 500,000 stops to check the vote for a candidate. That is way over the top. We strongly urge the Secretary of State to not adopt these temporary regulations, as this requirement would clearly significantly increase the number of full-time equivalent workers to conduct the hand count. This requirement does have an economic impact on the public, as it would materially increase the cost to the public and thereby having a diverse effect contrary to item 4 per your statements pursuant to NRS 233B.0603.
Thank you, Mr. Camp. I've commented on some of your, I've replied to some of your comments earlier. So I won't, I will say, and I believe actually Mr. Ott has a question for you here in a second, but the 2 quick comments I'd like to say is I think by maybe us talking separately, we could go through again, maybe what we envision the process to be based on those, that year of best practice review and development. Because I think, as I mentioned, right, with the, getting to the 5th vote so that, Governor Jones, that's his 5th one, is really just to get that validation, that sync, to make sure that you don't have to go back through. And similarly, having the 2 tally clerks counts as the 2, so it would not require an entire exhaustive recount of approximately 28,000 ballots and then starting over from scratch and doing them all again. And then similar to the standardization of the writing utensils, similar to the standardization of the need for gloves of some sort. I think that given the public's eager desire for better transparency and a clear understanding of how elections are ran and administered. One thing that we've noticed, again, that for example, Clark County, and there's some counties that have sent these to us, having that scale diagram, which essentially, again, in our minds is a blueprint, right? To show where things are going to happen so that a member of the public who is interested in the process could bring these regulations and have a copy of that, the plans that are in place provided by a clerk so they could show up and understand what they're looking at and have, again, further details about the process. Those are absolutely things that I believe will be standardized far beyond just this process moving forward, because again, they're identified as these best practices relating to security and transparency. And I wholeheartedly agree that this isn't one sliver of elections that we need to focus on, right? It's all the entirety of our electoral process that is worthy of transparency and security. Mr. Ott, do you have a question, please?
Could I ask, could we focus on my first statement though? We can deal with all this stuff as far as the details and all that other good stuff. But what I first said was, if I'm going to do a parallel process using a tabulation, I believe that I am already meeting the Secretary of State's requirements. And I would think that since this is Nye County doing this, and there's not really anybody else I see stepping up to the plate or that has an active plan to do it, I would think if the ideal situation would be to work with the Secretary of State's office, to use this as a test, to see how it works, to have that transparency you were talking with, because I had every intention of having a town hall with the public here in Nye County. And since this only represents, Nye County represents 1.6% of the voting population in the state, I think that it would behoove the Secretary of State to work with Nye County and to see this as again, this is a system conversion attempt. And in any system conversion attempt that anybody that's been through an accounting system put in, or a sales system, or your new voter registration and, you know, tracking system, you'd want to do a parallel process with what you've already have in place. And that's really my intent. So if I use the procedures as part of this that are already part of this, using tabulators and a full paper ballot process, which is totally within the realm of the ability of the, you know, current regulations, I see no reason why I would need to also follow these. Now, if I were to go to solely a hand count process, I fully understand why we would need to work things out so that, you know, we plan for the future and this becomes a model for things. But my intent is, by doing that parallel process, for it to be a model, for it to identify the, you know, the warts and all the little problems that occur under public scrutiny, but also to be a validating process to eliminate discussion about the elections. I'm tired of it. I'd rather we be focusing on bigger issues rather than whether we can trust our election systems.
And Mr. Camp, to be clear, Esmeralda and Lander did similar processes, used mechanical devices, and then followed up with some level. And this was during the primary. So, and yes, the secretary and the staff here at Elections Division worked closely with those clerks to affect that. So I certainly would anticipate the same going forward. Quick note, by the way, slightly off topic. Did you all know that direct private messages in the chat are also recorded and will become public record here as soon as we're completed? If you didn't know that, I would like you to remember, again, my original request that everybody treat each other with dignity and respect. Even if you think a direct message is secret, it is not, and it will be on the public record here probably within about 2 hours. So again, please remember dignity and respect at all times in all directions, please. Mr. Ott, do you have a comment or a question?
Yeah, Greg Ott, Deputy Attorney General with the Attorney General's office. Question from Mr. Camp about the parallel process, and I was going to ask you about this. That's why Mark didn't address it. But so are you envisioning the existing count that I think Nye County has done historically with the machines, and then a parallel hand count going on at the same time? And is that what you mean by a parallel process?
Yes.
Okay. And if those two, hopefully, of course, they would match, and so you'd be reporting the same number regardless of which one would control. But do you have an opinion, or has a decision been made on which one would control if they report different results?
Well, the reality of my decision to do that is, as a Nye County clerk who's obviously gotten a little bit of attention as a result of this, you know, I have no intention of doing anything that would jeopardize the vote, and nothing that would jeopardize the ability to get results in on election night. However, to develop a process so that we could free ourselves of those machines, you know, I would like to have a parallel process where, and I'm working on this right now to ensure that the batches that we put through the tabulator are the same batches that we would put through the hand count. And therefore, we would have an exact match by batch. And in the adjudication process, should kick out the same sort of results. So if we've got an item that in the hand count process requires an adjudication, I would expect that that we would understand what kinds of items are going to be kicked out through the tabulation process as an adjudicable ballot, and that we would have the appropriate training to identify those things so that the same sort of adjudication occurs in the hand count process. So I do see that it would be a check on that. And if they all match, then the whole world would be happy. Oh, great, our tabulators are doing their job. If they don't match, then we've got some digging to do. So I fully believe that with my process and the kind of front loading and loading we have on the receipt of ballots, because most of the ballots are there, 63% roughly are being delivered by the 15 days before the election. When people get those ballots in the mail, they generally fill them out and send them in. And so my brief amount of research I've had with the actual team here would indicate that there's a real front end loading of the tabulation process and getting things in the system. So again, that would allow for a front end loading of the hand count. And so as we've seen during the early voting, there is really nothing going on. Matter of fact, about 19%, about 19% of the ballots are early voting. So over a 15-day process, that allows for a reasonable hand count process to match the tabulation. The only issue you have is on election night. And so on election night, you would maybe have to put a greater priority on the tabulation because everyone wants to get their results by 10 o'clock or whenever they need to be submitted and released, because we're a society that has to have now. We've been taught that. But nevertheless, that still gives me a considerable number of days to complete the hand count process for what would roughly be around 17% of the 30,000 votes that go through. And with the sufficient number of 5-man teams, we should no doubt be able to complete our hand count process in the time we need to deliver results. I'd like to see it happen on the same day.
Keeping in mind, of course, that we still have the 4 days after election day to receive the mail ballots. But I think if I understand your process right, as those came in, they would be, signature verification tabulated essentially as they came in. Is that?
That's correct. That's correct. Same sort of process, because really, when you look at it, even in the primary, we probably got about 500 ballots that came in, maybe a little bit more, closer to 1,000. So double that for the general election. That really is no burden on any kind of hand count process.
Mr. Ott, does that clarify for you, or do you have a follow-up question?
Well, I think it provided a tremendous amount of detail about what Mr. Camp is envisioning. I think that he's thinking about things really in a detail-oriented way to set it up for the maximum possibility that everything matches. I don't know that it's an impossibility that there is a mismatch, and I don't know which one of those controls, and that may be legally significant in whether these regulations would apply or not. And this may be something that we can discuss offline, Mr. Camp, with you or the DA who assists you with these things. And you may not have fully formulated exactly how it will work yet, but I'm still not sure what happens if there is a mismatch.
Well, it would be no different than if you were to rely totally on the tabulation process, and then later on, the Board of County Commissioners says, hey, I want you to do an audit, and it's going to be a hand count. And so to me, it's right now, the regulations provide for me to do a tabulation process, and we rely on that tabulation process 100%. So I see the verification being the hand count process, sort of a simultaneous check on that. And since if I had to follow your regulations, I might as well just hang it up, because it's never going to work. Okay, it's to me, the number of resources is an absolute impossibility. Maybe for I think it was 317 votes they counted in Esmeralda County, is a lot different than 30,000.
And you highlight a great point. In our research, that's something that came up repeatedly. The average number of voters in the jurisdictions across the United States that actually conduct pure hand count tabulations is less than 800 registered voters total in the average, again, number of in those jurisdictions. So
I've done the same research, by the way. So
no, absolutely.
And
that's part of the reason why we developed these the way we did, specifically to make them scalable, to support larger quantities.
My biggest problem with this whole thing, you could take everything else and it's batch size and the stopping to do the count, and the double count, batch size, and the stopping after the votes of 5.
I understand. And again, I think if we maybe talk through that separately, you'll see that those were not intended to be obstacles even remotely. And I think, again, based on the way as part of my research, I ultimately had to have someone kind of show me and act it out. And then like the light bulb came on for me and I said, okay, it's not like a formalized process that's nearly as invasive, but I understand your concerns because, and I'm glad that you're concerned, frankly, because those timelines, again, we're kind of crossing the Rubicon there. If we get to the end of the night on the 10th day and do not have a county commissioner certification of a canvass of the votes, and I don't think any of us want to get to that point by any stretch of the imagination.
And that's the purpose of the parallel process with the tabulation, because therefore I can, again, just like when I was a controller in various parts of my life, we put in new systems. You never just shut the old system off and start a new one. You do a parallel process so that we can meet your requirements, but also be able to work the bugs out of the new and proposed process. And you want, in any kind of like an accounting system implementation, this is just the same thing. We're counting votes rather than beans. You would want to make sure that those results match. And that is part of the process of validating the new system.
The last question I have, Mr. Camp, and then we'll move on to some other comments, unless you have anything else, is so you do envision it as a transitory process, that we would do you're planning on a parallel process to ultimately then cease the use of mechanical voting systems in Nye County. Is that the idea, being maybe a couple election cycles, maybe through 24 and then in 26 or something, when you've worked out the kinks, so to speak, and are confident in the process, then at some point in the future is when you're envisioning ceasing the use of mechanical tabulating devices? Is that right? Or would it remain a parallel process going forward, so that there is a series of guardrails, so to speak, that don't rely on human eyes and exhaustion and concerns about timelines, or even poll worker availability, right? We think, and certainly nobody was expecting what happened in 2020 to occur or impact the election cycle the way it did. But there were significant challenges trying to get poll workers because of, for a number of reasons across the country. If that something were to happen again, unexpected like that, and certainly pray it's not a pandemic or something else disastrous like that, but is that the way you envision it, that it would be a transition to only hand counting?
Well, again, like in any system transition process, if it doesn't work, and I fully anticipate that we can get it to work, and I would hope that we can prove to you and to those who are doubting and have significant doubts that it can work, that you'd make that decision at that point in time. Again, as I've said over and over again, I will never ever do anything as clerk to jeopardize the accuracy, security, and the timeliness of the vote. So, but my goal is to develop a process that can be used throughout Nevada and throughout any other state that may have a larger size. Because when you start breaking things down, you could do this by precinct, because it happens to be in Nye County that we kind of treat it all as one. We may have voting centers, but the reality is we treat it from a process point of view as a precinct in total. But because our vote total is similar to, let's say, like a precinct that would be treated as a unique entity in other states and in other cities, this could be a model for that.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Camp. We'll certainly be in touch, and I appreciate your comments today. Good afternoon, Silver State Voices, please.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Cesar Carvajal, spelled CESAR-CARVAJAL, and I am the Democracy Manager with Silver State Voices. We are here in opposition to the opposed temporary regulations concerning the hand counting of ballots. Within the past year, we have seen a number of county commissions across Nevada propose resolutions that would harm our democratic process, and the use of hand counting as the primary form of ballot tabulations is one of them. Apart from diminishing the accuracy, efficiency, and security of our elections, the hand counting of ballots is bound to cause additional mayhem when it comes to certifying elections, and it would impact election outcomes not only at the local level, but also nationally. Hand counting ballots would cause an unnecessary strain on election departments across Nevada, and it would leave our elections vulnerable to the inevitable human error that it would bring. We urge election officials to oppose the hand counting of ballots and any regulations that would facilitate this process. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate your comments today. Ms. Val, if you could please state your name and spell it for the record, please.
Valerie White, Valerie, white like the color. A few comments. I heard you say in the interest of increased transparency. I had a problem with that because transparency was not even delivered in Washoe County. We were 50 feet away from critical processes. And so there wasn't transparency in our county. Given that this would be a new method of counting votes, it would seem that you would need a new method for observation. And the present statutes detailing observation rights for the public do not adequately address what would happen with a hand-counted paper ballot election. So I looked up another state's observation statute, and I can put it in the chat for you to see, which would definitely improve if we were to go to a paper ballot election, how we could have improved observation. Viewing someone counting paper ballots from 50 feet away lets me know that people are holding pens and making tally marks, but I cannot see that they are doing it honestly. And that's the purpose of meaningful observation. The second thing is why historically ballots were counted by hand. And I'm puzzled why anyone would say that they cannot be accurate, because they were accurate for centuries. It was only until after 2000 that they began to use mechanical systems, or shortly before that. But yes, hand counting can be accurate with good processes. So, and then I kind of am understanding Mr. Komp's comments and his concern for the amount of time it would take to complete these processes detailed in these regulations. And it would make it seem that the intent of these regulations is to make a hand-counted paper ballot election so time-consuming and or expensive that it would dissuade counties from conducting a paper ballot count election. And it needs to be streamlined. And I'm kind of wondering, when I've looked at other states, and you mentioned New Hampshire, Idaho, and was it Texas that you mentioned as the other state that has hand
No, ma'am.
counting?
Arizona, Idaho, Kansas, and New Hampshire.
Okay, Arizona, Kansas, I missed. Okay, so is there a reason why you didn't just take their regulations straight forward and use them here? And if so, what is that reason? Because I assume that they've already been conducting those elections. I don't know. I think everybody has experienced where the situation where there's been a need for a process definition or regulations, and then more and more and more detailed regulations get added into it until it becomes just a mess, an absolute mess. And I'm kind of concerned that that's what's happened here. If you began with other states' regulations and then we added to them, it's just going to make it more convoluted and difficult for counties to complete. So if you could just answer that question, why you did not just take in other states directly, and how you plan to address the observation, because it is a different counting method, and how citizens are actually going to get truly meaningful observation. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Short answer in regards to why we didn't just copy paste Idaho to us is because their laws are extensively different. different timelines, and this is across the board, really the entire country. The laws are different, the timelines are different, the requirements are different. Again, a jurisdiction somewhere in the country that executes hand count tabulations and never uses mechanical voting systems has kind of a process in place, but if they only have 300 registered voters, that would not work given what we're trying to do for standardization and, again, increasing transparency and security across our state. So that's really, I think, kind of in a nutshell, everything that we do when we talk to our counterparts across the country as election officials, we view it through the lens of Nevada. What really matters to our electorate and what's going to help our electorate given our laws. There were a lot of great ideas that I heard elsewhere that just simply, wouldn't have made sense, or I think, like you said, would have further complicated a process given our timelines and these other sorts of things. In regards to the increased transparency, that's also something that's going to continue to move and develop as we look to the future. Again, from the secretary down to every single county election official and member of their staff, and certainly every staff member here in the elections division, we all want the public to see and to understand, again, while balancing the protection and the secrecy of the ballot and the protection of that personally identifiable information. It's a fine line that we have to stay balanced on, and is certainly something that moving forward and looking into future election cycles will continue to refine. Clerks will have new ideas. There will be new technology, new locations, right? And many of the election officials across our state are looking at new locations to accommodate some of the machinery needed or even just storage space to count mail ballots properly. And a big part of that calculus and the square footage now is, where can people stand? How can we incorporate the public so that even if they have to socially distance, even if it's, there's people, there's a high school in town and they want to see it too. And we've got people from out of state. How can we have enough space so that Nevadans can watch the electoral process here? So that will continue to be a moving target, but certainly something that we're going to continue to aspire to improve.
I'm still concerned. I mean, whether we aspire to it or not, Nye County is moving forward with this, and they deserve to have meaningful observation in this election coming up, not in the future, something we aspire to. And so I'm still concerned that improved observation details are not included in these regulations. And I don't know about Mr. Kampf, but as a person who observed for many hours, we did not have meaningful observation, and that does not lead to increased trust. And then the last thing is, in Washoe County, when the ballots were received, the envelopes came in, they were separated by precinct, then they were signature verified, and then they were opened and removed from the envelope, and both sides, if there were two sides of the ballot, was inspected for any kind of damage or voter identification. At that point, those ballots were clearly anonymous. There was no voter identification on those ballots. So there's no reason that in the observation, while they're doing the tallying, that we could not have closer observation. No privacy is going to be released. They're not going to have their privacy. What's the word I'm looking for? They're going to maintain their privacy because the ballots have already been reviewed to see if there was anything on there. So observation, close observation within 5 feet needs to be in place. So thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. I appreciate your comments, and we'll certainly take them into consideration. Mr. Williams, good afternoon.
Oh, good afternoon. Oscar Williams, Reno, Nevada. Do you want me to spell my name? Is that necessary?
Sir, it's on the screen. I appreciate it, unless it's spelled differently than you have it on there. Otherwise,
no, good. That's a format. Great. A couple of points and then a couple of questions. I've tried to do a cost comparison of hand counting versus the machines. The problem is I've been hampered by a lack of disclosure from Washoe County. I know back in around 2018, 2019, they got over $4.2 million in grants to buy equipment and training and supplies and stuff, and they've received several more millions since then for increased leasing and training and whatever, replacement of bad machines. I see, from what I can tell, the cost increases from hand counting compared to machines is negligible. In fact, we're paying election workers $11 an hour. I think we could probably go to $15 an hour. And I think we could pay a night shift a little premium too. The cost is really not the issue. Nobody was crying about the cost of the machines when we were buying machines. What matters to me is that my vote counts at any cost. Accuracy is paramount. And with that goes voter trust. And with voter trust, we get turnout. That's representative of the government or the people. And that's how it kind of works. So I just wanted to make those points. In terms of questions, in terms of this proposed regulation, section 3.3, work schedule for hand count must not be more than 16 hours. What happens after 16 hours?
Well, sir, I appreciate the question. And that was another one of the best practices. We identified that talking to folks that do these already across the country, they said that there's a kind of a finite point for humans when it comes to staring at little circles and trying to identify if there's a pinprick of an overvote or a stray line that would indicate an overvote that would, of course, negate that vote cast for a certain race. In the discussions that came up, again, this was something that we heard time and time again. If you don't standardize and mandate limits to the amount of hours that are able to be worked, then what ends up happening is that you have your poll workers in front of you, and there's a tendency, again, a very real, very understandable tendency to want to, gosh, just push through and try to keep working as late as possible. And then thinking about the average age of poll workers across the country, right? Like it's not necessarily 18 to 22-year-olds, and having worked a lot with 18 to 22-year-olds, I wouldn't use them as a gold standard anyway for this sort of thing. But there's a recognition that the later you go, the more errors will occur. And so you're caught between 2 points, a desire to complete the count in accordance with whatever state statutes and timelines you have, recognizing that you have people in front of you now who are helping you now do this process with the kind of that little voice in the back of your head as an election official that people are getting sloppy, folks are falling asleep at the tables, and that ultimately they're all kind of looking at you to see if are you going to tell us to stop now, please? Recognizing that they're tired, or are you going to push ahead and try to accomplish what you're doing, and then just accept more errors? So having the hours that amount of time standardized and limited to 16 hours, which again is I mean, plenty of 16-hour days, no small amount, therefore would enable an election official to say, look, we're limited by the state, 16 hours a day. I, as the clerk, am going to supervise 2 8-hour shifts, which is a monstrous feat. Again, if somebody hasn't done that in a while, but still also allowing for the scalability. Right, there's no limitation on the number of tally teams that we proposed, so that in one county, a smaller county, maybe if they wish to do hand count tabulation, they may have 4 4-man teams, and that may be all they need. They may do 8, and they may want 16 hours total, and then they could have 2 separate 8-hour shifts of 16 teams. If you need more, you certainly can have them, but at the very least, then it affords the election official who, again, remember, election day, it's not a finish line for election officials, not by far. Now, when you think of all the work that has to be done with the acceptance of mail ballots going forward, the signature curing process that has to occur, the preparation of documents for the Board of County Commissioners at the state level leading up to November 22nd, when we have the Supreme Court canvass, recognizing that even the extra work beyond that, if there's a request for a recount or a contest, this is, if they're working multiple weeks of 12 to 18-hour days, again, the quality of the work they're doing is going to decrease exponentially. So by having a limited number of hours identified in this regulation, and recognizing that it's probably a best practice across the board that we need to discuss and consider further, that was the intent really between the hours.
Okay, I got it. Thank you. However, the way I read it, it looks like counting is halted after 16 hours. Is that incorrect?
So the idea would be that after 16 hours, again, there is some wiggle room that, again, depending on who it is. But yes, ultimately 16 hours of counting, if you want to maximize the amount of time and effort that you're putting into that, again, as it currently stands, there would be a pause. Again, you could have your 100 teams of 4 doing one 8-hour shift followed by another 8-hour shift with a different 100 teams of 4 to really maximize the time. But the idea was that it's a forced limitation specifically to address the increased risk of errors that are historic when it comes to hand count tabulations.
Oh, I agree. And I suggested to you in my letter to you that you might consider 6-hour shifts, particularly in regards to accommodations to pregnant women. It's in the statute. 6-hour shifts, and I agree, the longer you make people work, the more error prone they're going to be. And so it's a big concern. Shorter shifts, give them more breaks, give them bottled water. There's nothing there that says they have to be serviced with any kind of food or beverage during all this. That could maybe be written in as an added thing. I'm going to move on if that's okay. I want to move down to point 7, I think it is. Point 8, a list of any outside vendors hired or who may be hired to consult. Now, I know that in Washoe County, they hired A&A Associates out of West Palm Beach to help with the election and also my next career path. They few $100,000 there that they and they've used these firms before, at least my next career path they've used before. And so I guess with regard to point 8, my question would be, does this refer to temporary staffers and or auditors?
No, sir. The list of vendors was specifically, again, external organizations. That was the intent.
Like a temporary staffing agency that's hired?
No, it was more along the lines of an organization that provides counseling, training, and those sorts of things. Again, open to discussion. Do you think it should? Do you have a recommendation one way or the other?
Well, I know, at least in Nye County, I mean, you got, only so many voters. I think they're going to handle their hand count beautifully. All right. But when you get into Clark County and Washoe County and you're dealing with hundreds of thousands, or, Clark's got 1.2 million registered voters. That's a lot of ballots, right? And certainly the process, the logistics of just manpower in processing all that paperwork is a Herculean effort. It's a big deal, and I'd like to see it be successful. And so they're very prone to hire temp agencies, and so that's what I thought when I read this. I thought that would be, but also, I have an interest in seeing independent agencies do an audit if requested. That's an issue that maybe is for another time, but I mean, it kind of. So there was some vagary in the wording, that's all. And that's all I have to add. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Williams. Good afternoon, ACLU of Nevada.
Good afternoon, Sadmira Ramic, SADMIRA RAMIC, here on behalf of the ACLU Nevada. Thank you for the opportunity to provide comment. We oppose the proposed regulations for hand counting all ballots and echo the comments of All Voting is Local and Silver State Voices. We appreciate your office's attempt to ensure higher standards for a hand count. However, permitting counties to hand count all ballots is not only bad public policy, but it violates Nevada state laws and the Nevada Constitution. While we recognize that Nevada state laws provide a choice to the Board of County Commissioners and or clerks on whether they use mechanical recording devices, such authority does not supersede other mandates under Nevada law, and especially not mandates under the Nevada Constitution. Under Nevada law, the Secretary of State and each county and city clerk must ensure that every voting system used in the state of Nevada meets or exceeds the standards for voting systems established by the U.S. Election Assistance Commission, including, without limitation, the error rate standards. Voting systems are broader than the term mechanical voting system and thus incorporate hand counting. The Nevada Constitution, which is the supreme law and supersedes any Nevada state laws, outlines the constitutional rights of voters. This includes a right to a uniform statewide standard for counting and recounting all votes accurately as provided by law. Hand counting all ballots violates both of these provisions in several ways. First, hand counting voting procedures produce more errors than vote counts using electronic equipment. Studies on hand counting procedures have repeatedly shown the inaccuracy of hand counting, as humans are notoriously poor at completing routine repetitive tasks, while tabulators, by contrast, are designed intentionally for this sort of repetition. Machines were first introduced for counting in recognition of human error. Second, because the error rate of hand counting ballots, especially for these larger counties, such procedure would not comply with the error rate standards of the U.S. Election Assistance Commission. And finally, hand counting in one county while using a mechanical device in another is not a uniform statewide standard for counting and recounting. These baseline voting system requirements assure protection of privacy, security, and accuracy of every ballot, and state law directs the Secretary of State and every county clerk to uphold these standards. As Chief Officer of Elections, the Secretary of State retains broad power to adopt regulations as necessary to carry out the provision of state and federal law related to elections and to adopt regulations for the conduct of elections. This includes the laws previously mentioned. We urge the Secretary of State to use this authority to uphold the rights of voters given to them by our state law and our Constitution, and not to condone, through the passage of these regulations, the baseless actions of these county officials. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. There's two things I would like to mention real fast. First, as part of our research, we did not limit it to just jurisdictions across the country who conduct hand counts. We also reached out to and had a conversation with members of the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. They're the organization who are primarily responsible for the legal defense of the Help America Vote Act, Civil Rights Act, National Voter Registration Act, Voting Rights Act, and others. Part of that discussion centered on the legality of this. If the possibility of a hand count at a state or county level would in fact violate any of the provisions of those federal laws. And it was a very clear answer of no, it would not. Though they did identify that there were requirements, for example, under the Help America Vote Act, for the requirement for one ADA compliant machine at each polling location and other things like that, that I think are absolutely pertinent to this discussion. The other comment, I just want to make sure that I don't believe I saw the written commentary from the ACLU for all voting is local. Perhaps I missed it. I'm certainly going to go back after this to review, but if possible, if you wouldn't mind, please resending it just to make sure that I have it for the record. I would appreciate that.
Yes, we did submit it. It was with the Brennan Center, All Voting is Local, Silver State Voices, and the ACLU of Nevada collaboratively.
I see. Okay. And I will review, and if I can't find it, I'll certainly reach out to make sure I get it from you. But thank you for your comments.
No problem. Thank you for listening.
Good afternoon, Ms. Gifford.
Thank you. I had to unmute myself. Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am, I can.
Thank you. I am Ellen Gifford, E-L-L-E-N. The last name is Gifford, G-I-F-F as in Frank, O-R-D as in Donald. I support the hand counting of ballots, and I support the comments of Mr. Mark Kemp, Mr. Oscar Williams, and Ms. Valerie White. Thank you very much.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for your comments. Good afternoon, Mr. Berdzinski, please.
Yes, you did get my name correct, so I thank you for that. I know it scares most people when they see it from the first time. The Nye County commissioners in a 5-0 vote instructed our clerk to implement paper ballots. And as a voter here in Nye County, I strongly agree with what the commissioners had instructed the clerk to do. In looking at the temporary regulations, I have concerns on a number of them, and one of them is the one where you have listed a date of April 15th of each year in which an election be held to submit the plan. Well, that can't be done. So if it can't be done, that means we will not have paper balloting for this November, and that would go against what the county commissioners here in Nye County want, and also I believe what the voters here in Nye County want. So I would not want to see these temporary regulations implemented. And I think Mr. Comp had explained the other areas as well, so I'm not going to go through and repeat each one. I believe that our voting here is very sacred. It's important. We need to have it open and clear. And I believe that since basically the Hanging Chad Institute problems that were in Florida has put a lot of mistrust into electronic voting system machines. And therefore, this is why people feel very strongly here in Nye County that we need to go to paper ballots. So that's my comments, and thank you very much for your time. And I hope you strongly consider not implementing so many of these very difficult regulations, especially the one on the April 15th requirement. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Thank you for your comments. And the discussion point about April 15th, we're certainly going to revisit that to make sure that there is a means or to identify transparency without somehow negating the possibility of that in the first place. So yes, sir, we'll review that and certainly consider it going forward. But thank you for your comments. Good afternoon, Ms. Lee, please.
I'm piggybacking on top of my wife's login. George Lee, that's Georgelee. I have a comment for the ACLU and for you particularly. Where were you guys with the accuracy rate of the machines when there was 68% failure rate of the signature identification machine? Why did you allow that to go on? And why haven't you outlawed that in this regulation?
Mr. Lee, so in regards to the, and just to be clear to the members of the ACLU, I'll answer this. One, sir, I think the concern in regards to the Agilus machine that was used in Clark County during the 2020 election cycle and continue to be used during the 2022 primary. This regulation does not touch on that. So certainly I would like to set up time perhaps after or separately so I can discuss that with you and we can review that decision and as to what that machine does and why the 68% rejection rate is actually a good thing. But as that falls outside of the scope of our regulations today, I am being gently reminded that I need to stay on the agenda. So sorry if it's possible, if you could please reach out to us at ND Elect, and I will absolutely set up time to talk to you separately. Good afternoon, Miss Betty, please.
Betty Klein from Douglas County. I've followed this discussion with a lot of interest since it's been a big discussion in our county. And I've repeatedly heard how more efficient it is, particularly from county clerks and registrars, to use machines rather than humans, and how much more money is saved for the county. I don't think money saved should be the price for our democracy, number one. The other thing I've never heard is how much it cost initially to acquire these machines and how much annual maintenance it costs for the software. I was a business owner. I had software in my office, and I know that's the maintenance is where the price tag came in, that these companies basically make their money. And in addition, I would like to support all the people that spoke before me that are for a hand count. Thank you for your service.
Thank you, ma'am. And Miss Betty, would you mind spelling your last name just so we have it for the record?
K-L-E-I-N, K-L-E-I-N, Klein.
Thank you. At this time, is there anybody else interested in, oh, I see one question, Ms. White in the chat. The PowerPoint presentation, I began the Zoom presentation with, yes, ma'am. You may remember, and in fact, I will put it into the chat right now, just to make it easily accessible for everybody, not only now, but then also after the fact. We have all of our regulations on a single website. Upon completion of this workshop today, and then once the video finishes doing its kind of recording thing, we'll get a transcription and some other information. We'll get it uploaded onto YouTube, and then very similar to the other regulatory workshops that we did before, we will put them on that page that I just put into the chat for your viewing pleasure. So if you check that website, Tuesday, I think, is realistic for the time to get the video, get it uploaded, and then take care of the website update. I anticipate it will be on there by Tuesday, and I will make a point to include the PowerPoint presentation as well, so that you can see that as part of it. At this time, are there any other questions or comments rather relating to proposed temporary regulation T 002-22? Yes, ma'am. I see another question from somebody in the chat regarding the cost of machines and the maintenance piece. As that is outside the scope of this agenda today, we'll certainly provide that separately. The easiest way to get that information, though, is to go to, or I'm sorry, is to send an email rather to our public information officer. And I will put that email there. If you send an email to the email I just put into the chat now, requesting any documents or public records, again, everything that we have, of course, is a matter of public record. We will be able to provide some detailed information regarding the costs. Or again, if you're interested in doing your own research on it, Assembly Bill 519 of the 2017 session was the bill that identified, and it was $8 million that the legislature provided for the cost of voting systems, but we have some other detailed information we can provide by reaching out to that link as well, or that email as well, please. Oh, Ms. Stewart, good afternoon, please.
Sorry about that. Hi, good afternoon. My name is Charlotte Stewart, and my question is, I know that you guys are going to be doing this, from my understanding, in Nye County first. And then is it kind of like you guys are going to see how it goes? What if you guys, what if you do the counting in Nye and discover, are they going to be using machines there to like compare the count? Is that going to happen? Or how does it work?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for the question. So to be clear, these regulations, proposed temporary regulations, do not direct any county to do anything unless the clerk, in coordination with the county commissioners or board of supervisors, make that determination. There are a number of counties that may do something similar. Again, Lander and Esmeralda conducted at least a partial hand count prior to the certification of the canvass of the primary election this past June. And Mr. Camp, the Nye County clerk, he has indicated an interest in doing so down in Nye County as well. And based purely, and again, Mr. Camp, please let me know if I misrepresent this at all, but he said that so far he's planning on using the machines, but then concurrently conducting a hand count, essentially as a validation of that process to ensure accuracy in both regards.
Okay, so my question is if it shows that the machines are terribly off on counting as opposed to the hand count, would that open up the ability for this election for other counties to be able to do it so that we can be sure that we're actually getting the people we voted for in office? Or would it just push it off till the next election?
That raises a very interesting question in regards to the validity. I will tell you, as part of our research also, the jurisdictions that conduct hand counts as an audit in larger jurisdictions all said that every time, and this is historic, whenever they would do a mechanical tabulation and then follow it up with a hand count audit, whenever there was an error and a discrepancy at all between the machines and the hand count, further review consistently showed that it was the human error of somebody missing an overvote or otherwise having an error, and that upon further review and scrutiny, the machines were accurate. But that does raise an interesting question, and you're right. If that situation were to emerge, it would raise a series of interesting discussions.
Okay, that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you. At this time, is there any other public comment? Anybody else interested in providing public comment relating to temporary regulation T 002-22? Going once. Mr. Lee, please.
Yes, sir. My previous statement was in favor of paper ballots and hand counting. And by mentioning the security problems that were run into during the 2020. I also feel that paper ballots and hand counting are extremely doable if the number of polling places increases to the size of the precincts. And therefore, it truly would be local. The only problem would be manpower, and that could be easily acquired from the various parties in our area. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments, Mr. Lee. Are there any other comments relating to temporary regulation T002-22 this time? Okay, this time public comment is closed on temporary regulation T002-22. We will now, excuse me, begin. This is agenda item 6 now for reference. General public comment on matters other than previously listed LCB file number. Comments will be limited to 2 minutes per person. Again, this is a general public comment on items not related to anything on the agenda. At this time, is anyone interested in providing public comment about a matter not on the agenda? If so, please identify yourself. Mr. Lee, do you have a public comment as well, or? Okay, thank you. Mr. Williams, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Oscar Williams, Reno, Nevada. Some basic questions. Are you aware that Washoe County is marking the ballots? They've got a system. The registrar did a life of a ballot infographic. Point 9 says they are marking the ballots, I believe, with a serial number or a barcode or something, so they can have like a third party do some sort of additional analysis. I'm just asking you if you were aware that Washoe County is marking ballots. Are you aware that Washoe County is marking ballots?
Yes, Mr. Williams, they're conducting a risk limiting audit, and that's part of the process in order to be able to, across the state, identify. It's an additional post-election audit now required by statute. And yes.
Oh, I wasn't aware that they were allowed to put it to mark the ballot at all. That there's a law, I guess, that's kind of in the way there that maybe has to be fixed. That's Secretary of State's job, but that was my question. Okay, next one. You mentioned before that the Secretary of State has a standardized registration form, but what about the homeless registration forms that Washoe County has and the DMV have? Are those authorized by Secretary of State?
Mr. Williams, for this portion of the general public comment, again, really, this is the 2 minutes that you can provide information. If you'd like to set up some time to discuss these concerns with me separately, certainly able to do so. But this unfortunately isn't the time.
Okay, one last quick one then. Are you aware that there were over 1.2 million wasted mail ballots in the 2022 primary statewide?
Mr. Williams, I'm keenly aware of the fiscal and operational impacts of our state laws.
I'm glad to hear that. We should talk again another time. Thank you for your time, sir. Have a good day.
Thank you. Ms. Thomas, good afternoon.
Thank you. Back, I think it was in the January workshops and stuff, I asked you about Washoe County's processing provisional ballots electronically. You appeared to not know that they were doing that, and you were going to look into that, and we kind of played tag on emails, didn't really get to connect with each other on that. Could you maybe share what you found on the provisional ballots and why Washoe County is doing them electronically and all the rest of them are not?
Yes, ma'am. I can say simply that I did find out that there's an appropriate and accepted process to conduct the provisional ballot process using machines. But again, in fact, I'm currently in the process of gathering some more information on that. If we could talk separately, I will be able to provide a lot more information to you here in the next couple of days, if possible.
Okay, so there is a way that they're separating them in the voting kiosks.
Yes.
So they are not counted until Saturday.
That is until after the eligibility to be a voter is validated. Yes, and then
so then those electronic ballots are connected to a voter
with
a voter ID somehow.
Yes, there's an ID in the machine that's a provisional ID so that we can extract if we identify that 0001 was an eligible voter, but 0002 is not. They are able to remove that, so it is not tabulated if that voter was not eligible to vote.
So I just meant that there is a specific voter record connected to that provisional ballot.
It's not a permanent thing, but yes, there's a way for us to identify and not cast
that specific voter's ballot.
Yes,
okay.
Yes.
All right, thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Good afternoon, Ms. Gifford, please.
Yes, I believe you probably read the comments I sent to you this week. Yes. So you know that I'm very interested in addressing the process for surrendered ballots. And I think you said at the beginning of this meeting that there could be a separate meeting set up to discuss such topics. Do I get in touch with you to try to arrange for that meeting?
Yes, ma'am. If you're able to send an email to nvelect@sos.nv.gov, we will absolutely be able to set up that meeting to discuss that topic for sure. And I will copy that back into the chat as well so that you have that quickly accessible.
Thank you very much.
Yes, ma'am. At this time, is there any other, I'm sorry, Mr. Williams, do you have an additional comment?
I do. One quick one.
Okay.
I don't believe in this regulation that there's any kind of measures to find counterfeit ballot stock. What are you guys doing? What is there? Is this the appropriate regulation to put in some measures to make sure that if the oval looks like it's a machine-filled oval, maybe that one should be put aside because it doesn't look like it's been hand-filled? Is there anything, weights and measurements, anything that can be input in this regulation to, since we're hand counting, well then, humans do a good job of seeing certain types of imperfections. And I would ask that be addressed at some point. Anti-counterfeit measures, please, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. At this time, is there, there was one individual, and ma'am, would you be able to type your name for the record, just so I can have that? Your question is briefly done compliance. Let me read down the comments. And yes, ma'am, I would say, again, recognizing the limitations of our ability to discuss during general public comment, certainly email us and I will set up time and we will be able to talk through the details of your questions and concerns. Otherwise, at this time, is there anybody else that is interested in providing public comment and not relating to an item that's on the agenda? Going once. Okay, excellent. In that case, public comment is closed. Please note that the Secretary of State may propose additional amendments following consideration of today's testimony and any further written comment from the public. To ensure that you receive a copy of the amendments in advance of the adoption hearing on the 26th, I would encourage signing up for the e-notification through the Secretaries of State website at nvsos.gov, and I will copy that into the chat as well. If you have any problems, please contact the Elections Division at 775-684-5705. And I will put that phone number into the chat also. Or email us at nvelect@sos.nv.gov. The last thing I will say is simply just a reminder, again, that the next adoption hearing is the next step. And that adoption hearing will be on the 26th at 10 a.m. And I'm copying the link to that notice, including the Zoom notification, into the chat now as well. Otherwise, again, on agenda item 7, thank you all for your comments and participation today. I truly appreciate it. This public workshop is adjourned at 3:11 p.m. Thank you very much.